Now, we've covered the victims, we've covered the evidence, we've covered the origin of the name Jack the Ripper. Now, we've covered most everything about this case, except for who Jack the Ripper really is. Now, of course, we'll never know for sure who he is because, well, they couldn't figure it out back then, and we can't figure it out for sure now. However, we can narrow down the suspects. And of course, to do that, we really need to know who the suspects were. Now, the suspect list has changed over the years because access to records has changed. Back then, it was not as easy to get records, and we didn't have as many records to pull from. So, the suspect list was very limited. However, now we've gotten a lot more records from different places, and the suspect list has grown, and we've been able to figure out who could be and who couldn't be Jack the Ripper. Now, one of the first suspects was actually just a few years after the murders had taken place in 1894. And this first suspect was named M.J. Druitt, who was a teacher who committed suicide in December of 1888. However, the reasons he was a suspect were completely wrong, because they thought that he was a doctor who was 41 years old and that he had committed suicide immediately after the last of the Ripper murders. However, M.J. Druitt was actually 31 years old, not a doctor, and he killed himself actually a month after the last Ripper murder. Now, no police officer had suspected him other than the chief constable, and there wasn't really too much information that actually pointed to M.J. Druitt, so he's really been discounted from the list of suspects. Now, later on, in 1903, a detective who was in charge of the Ripper investigation said that he thought that a man named George Chapman was Jack the Ripper. However, no other police officer agreed with this opinion, and most everything that we have learned now about criminal profiling has pretty much discounted George Chapman as a possible suspect. Now, the next one was, he was a man who was put in an insane asylum right after the Ripper crimes, and he died soon after being put in the asylum. However, just like the rest, there are some problems with this story. Although he was a real person and he was put in an insane asylum, all of his records say that he was a calm, harmless lunatic who only heard voices in his head and was a picky eater. The dates that he was in the insane asylum are wrong, and he did not die that soon after he was put in the asylum, but he lived on into the year 1919. So there's really not too much information that points to him either. Now, the next man, named Michael Ostrog, was investigated, but again, there's nothing really that points to him, especially considering he was only guilty of being a con man, not a murderer. And although he was crazy, he also was not the type of man who would have been thought to have been the Ripper. Now, the last suspect is the one that we really need to be paying attention to, because his name is Dr. Francis Tumblety, and he is the man that I believe is Jack the Ripper. Now, he is the latest suspect only being discovered in 1993. And he was only discovered because a collector of crime memorabilia found some letters written by different people who were working on the Ripper case in the early 1900s. And these letters were written by people such as the man who was in charge of the secret department in Scotland Yard and the chief constable, and they were all talking about the Whitechapel murders, and they discussed their thoughts on who the actual murderer was. They pretty much were in agreement that Dr. D, who is assumed to be Dr. Druitt, they all agreed that he was most likely not the murderer, and most of them had never even heard of a Dr. Druitt. However, they did think that there was a very strong possibility that a man they referred to as Dr. T was the actual Ripper. Now, the man who was trying to say that Dr. T was the Ripper did not actually have much proof that he was the Ripper, but there's really no doubt that he is an actual suspect, because he fled to America when Scotland Yard detectives started to investigate him. However, Scotland Yard did not continue to view him as a serious suspect since he was in America. Now, what really makes him seem as if he might be the Ripper is that he was a doctor, which means that he would have had knowledge of the human body that would explain the way that the Ripper victims were killed. He was also put in an insane asylum as well. So, having a crazy doctor who fled to America when he was being investigated really seems a little bit suspicious. And I really think that he is very likely to be Jack the Ripper, because he did flee to America, and I think that's one of the reasons why he was not discovered and why he was not a much more serious suspect, because there was just no way of finding out more information about him after he left the country. Now our look at the unsolved case of Jack the Ripper is coming to a close, so let's just take a look at what we know now and how it is different from what we knew at the beginning. So if you will remember, at the beginning we said that the Ripper was a murder in London in the 1880s. Now we've learned quite a bit since then, so let's just go over some of that right now. Now, of course, we know that Jack the Ripper is a name given to a murderer who is also known as the Whitechapel Murderer and the Leather Apron. We know that he killed people by strangling them, slitting their throats, and then removing an internal organ as a trophy. We know that the name Jack the Ripper came from letters called the Ripper letters, and we know that one of the reasons that the name Jack the Ripper came about is because he ripped one of the internal organs out of his victims. And speaking of his victims, we now know that he had a number of victims. We really don't know how many exactly, but we know the number ranges anywhere from 4 up to 9. We know that there is no way of actually telling who the Ripper actually was, but we do know that there is a very strong possibility that Dr. Francis Tumblety is the real Ripper. So today we might have just solved one of the greatest mysteries of all time. Or we could be totally wrong. Either way, thanks for watching, and I hope that you learned a lot.